the common area and to look at the lounge and the common spaces from the unit. So there's alternating levels that happens. The alternating levels that happens is always a space to have a constant connection to the community as being an individual. So the parallel organization of the units form an array of unique adaptation, forming its own story that can be seen in the Choice of Bombay. The laundry, elevator, and staircases are taken out. So the laundry, elevator, and staircases are taken out so as to create a visually connected, interactive core for the lounge spaces, which is unhindered by any other utility. So through this particular project, I'd like to bring out two critical struggles that I faced. One was negotiating between the individual identity and the enrichment community. And by extension, the role we play as individuals or architects in decision making. So if I have to extend the same question to the methods and processes, do we sometimes have to develop methods that are almost counterintuitive so that it can challenge our position as architects and decision makers? Because here my project almost challenges to what degree or questions to what degree an architect can make a decision and how much is open to the individual to be made. So, and how does such a method of designing place itself in the conversation between intuition versus rationalization as an architect? Thank you. If any questions.
Thanks so much for that. Just a question that's occurring to me and a point of clarification, which I know we're only meant to be asking for clarification. It occurs to me in your final statement when you're saying the issues that were raised for you in undertaking the project. A question then was raised to me in terms of was this a project undertaken as a sort of speculative experiment that allowed you as a sort of architecture student to explore a number of ideas and test their limits? So sort of not a proposition for a possible future, but a means of speculating on what architecture can do, which might mean designing something that's not necessarily what you would want for a community, but which allows you to think through the problems of designing mass housing. Is it that kind of experiment, or is it really proposing a future for mass housing?
It is clearly not proposing a future for mass housing because we almost developed a society also that we wanted. So we created our own context where we tested and experimented our ideas and even methodology because both the iterations we were left it was left up to us to devise the methods to go about designing. So it was a personal experiment of that. Then we move on to the next presenter, Nitya Shri. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Nitya, and my thesis is called Slowing Down, exploring food through space. And so I'll be presenting the structure of the project and go through it through the lens of tools and methods and the sequences. The thesis began with an intent of having a defined structure or framework at some point between research and design. The framework can be in the form of a list, a diagram, a mind map, etc. And the structure itself became an important tool in applying research to design. So in this case, it was a set of questions. And these four questions linked the thesis from a large non-architectural idea to a specific detail in design. In pursuit of astronomical success, we are losing our collective humanity, our instinct to reconnect with the world around us and within ourselves. We need to slow down to reconnect. We need to slow down to engage with ourselves and to appreciate the mundaneness in our lives. And the definition of slow came from reading Pico Iyer or from watching Japanese animation movies or to, well, to cope with the anxiety of being away from home in a city. And when they materialize to words, they happen to answer the question, why slow? Let's move in a step closer to understand what exactly is slow. Slowness does not mean moving at snail's pace, but is about quality over quantity. It is shared, it's multidisciplinary, it's shaped to particular cultural and geographic context, it's humble, it's open source, it belongs to communities or societies, it's metaphysical, intuitive, and it designs for individuals first and commercialization second. And these were direct takeaways from reading existing research on slowness. Having read Now Psycho's Travels to South Indian Kitchens and having an appreciation for food, it felt right to enter through the kitchen, a place that has the power to connect anyone and everyone. And diagrams, which were generated while reading Michael Pollan's book, became useful in arriving at a program. Drawing here became a tool to interpret what I read. And these are what came up while reading. Whether they were related to the chapter or not, I just put it down. And they did help some point. So his chapter on hand taste was taken forward intuitively by my guide and I to see what the difference was between hand taste and machine taste. And so I went to grind chutney by hand on a grinding stone in this mess nearby. And this mess not only, this kitchen mess, not only um, happened to be an important point of intervention in the thesis later on, but also verify the relevance of the question, how can food become a tool which carries the rituals of relay and why is it important? When we step in closer, we fish out the elements that make us slow. So, for example, while going for study trips, I noticed how there are people sitting on tinays or on flints or not doing anything in the afternoons, and it's a part of, yeah. The flints become hosts for entertainment. They become a point of repose. It came from paying attention to how we're forced to slow down sometimes physically. And this is what I've noticed in Auroville, how we have small barricades to slow us down. It came from noticing how I slowed down one day while walking. I saw this moss filled wall, which was that, and that became kind of a movement. It came from observing how people pause to remove their chappals. And it came from noticing how people are engrossed in their food, while they're waiting for the food to be made in food stalls, etc. It's a moment of pause in their life. And I also read and recontextualized existing research on slowness. So the observations that I had in general came and sat in this chapter, and they kind of became an inventory box for design. And they answer the question: what are the parameters that slows one down? Um, we now walk through the first task, an intervention in Revama's mess, while I explain how each principle or each item in this inventory was applied. So Revama's mess is located in the south of Bangalore in a densely populated town called Anjanapuram. So she has a kitchen, she has a dining area, she has a machine room where she grinds poddies and dosa batter, atta, all of that. And then she also has her kitchen and a room where she stays and her attached toilet to it. And there are around 60 people who go here every day. And so mess closes by 11 a.m. So the mess became a point of intervention because there are hidden aspects that display the qualities of slowness. This task intends to expose these qualities that were lost. So principle one, that's called interval and pause, is about physically slowing down a person. It's reflected in the fragmented program. So you move across zones that have different elements of pause. For example, a chappal stand to physically stop you in, um, as a point where you're looking at your food being prepared, or people moving the chappal, or a point of interaction between the road and the mess itself. A quote where chutney is ground, like how she used to before, and before she shifted to um, electric grinder. The dining area where you sit and eat while noticing Revama cook first, interacting with her, looking at your food being prepared, etc. And lastly, her kitchen garden or a space where you exit. So larger stepping stones around the mess also unconsciously inform you to stand a little longer at these points of interaction and leading. Principle 2, after object, talks about the intangible aspects which give identity. For example, food cooked over fire. The role of fire is not to provide heat, but to smolder wood. Is not only to provide heat, but to smolder wood. The smoldering is what flavors the food. And the second smoke imparts a subtler woody flavor because of its starry and pungent compounds. The smoke also has the power to inform people that something is cooking, and that brings them to this. Deliberate contemplation is about plinths and steps. They not only act as transition zones, but also are hosts for entertainment, rest, and celebration. Time and Tide is about how slow design recognizes that richer experiences emerge from maturations of artifacts, environments, and systems over time. For example, a moss wall reminds us that we're not living in machines. Cooking and communication is a principle that talks about the importance of connection. Revama operates on as more like a kitchen than a commercial canteen, and it's evident in the way she interacts with her customers. Communication through architecture can be through fenestration, jolly wall, movement through processes, etc. Another layer to peel out in this design task is how drawing by hand was a useful tool. Drawing by hand in itself is an act of slowness because we have time to think and observe our actions as the pencil moves over paper. And as I draw each brick on the wall, for example, I say I'll have to probably remove a few bricks in this area to make this part porous so that somebody who's entering from here can look into it. Now, if somebody's going to enter over here, then maybe they can walk through this while they look at the kitchen and where they take some place or whatever. They move into this spot. And if they're going to move over here, and if this is going to become a pause point, then maybe I can give a larger stone where they can stand comfortably, and that informs them that the space is friendly to bare feet. Or and if this is an entry, then there'll have to be another larger stone to put, rangoli or the columns. And if we're going to put rangoli there, then we'll have to store the rice pot, and then I'll have to give a niche. So that was the thought process by drawing by hand. And writing down these thoughts as notes on paper also became useful because once you go back to them, you see what worked and what didn't work, and you're reminded of the reason behind drawing something. But in order to explore other concepts such as names like movement, physically slowing down, like intense processes like coffee brewing, etc., it made sense to have a larger site of intervention or a destination for deliberate slowness. Again, a layer of drawing by hand in plan helped in visualizing the design tasks on different scales. It not only allowed me to witness the site in its entirety and look at people meander between pavilions, etc., but also enables me in picturing myself as a person engaged in space and walking over pavement and looking at bread being built, etc. So the site is broken by unbuilt spaces. One moves amongst the plantation, plinths, pavilions, and courts, which have varying levels of enclosure. One meanders between buildings, and each of these buildings kind of expose some kind of a process. Ramps here not only slow down people physically, but also make them conscious of space. Moreover, they are aids to connect space. Kitchen activities also spill out around the canteen, such as kitchen activities spill out around the canteen, that's washing vessels or washing vegetables, cook, cutting vegetables, and preparation of food, etc. All of these. And one idea was to have movement between these processes so that as children move through the space, they're exposed to this kind of thing. Films not only act and not only help in connecting visually, but also bring enclosure to space. Um, so applying each principle from research opens up plausible possibilities only when you work at a scale of 1:50. And this task was all in 1:200 or 1:500. But if it was when it came to applying the elements, I realized that 1:50 or 1:20 would be a better scale. Or perhaps I would have had to do a lot more research to design each element in the scale of 1:20. To sum it up, structuring through frameworks, reading, noting down, observing, and most importantly, drawing by hand are tools and methods which provide opportunities which we aren't aware of before starting the project. These tools help in finding a different meaning to design. Yeah.
Thank you, Nitya. Are there any clarification questions?
In the second project, you showed a series of drafted plans, overall, which you said 500 or 200, and some isometric or part plan part sketches. So could you just quickly tell me what was the sequence of it? Was it that you first made these 500, 200 plans and then made part sketches, or were they going parallel?
I think they were going parallelly, but it was majoritarily 1:500 or 200 with bit of what I was looking at. View.
Any other questions? Okay, then we'll move to the next session.
Hello. Yeah. So hi everyone, my name is Pranay from School of Environment and Architecture, and my thesis design is titled In Praise of Darkness. So my thesis dissertation, The Architectural Uncanny, concluded with the idea of embracing darkness. Darkness as a conceptual trope brings out the idea of the dark space, the unsafe space, and the normal space. It is also the darkness that kind of lies outside our epistemes of knowledge, giving rise to a certain obscurity. We make sense of a world in terms of spectrums with binary extremes, day and night, land and water, inside, outside, public, private, and so on. And often one end of the perceived spectrum is dominant, while the other is submissive and lies in the dark space. The in between that lies within the spectrum, also in the grays, also seems to be forgotten. And my thesis design addresses this kind of dark space. It's not the only the absence of light and the darkness which is kind of perceived, it created in perceiving the world through these dualities. So the site is Mindspace, which is located in the western suburb of Malad in Mumbai. The reason to select this site was kind of because of its liminal quality. The area has been reclaimed from the swamps that separate the city from the sea and is kind of developed privately. So you sort of see all the high skyscrapers and the office buildings. And the line that separates the creek from the Nala is also in some sense blurred. The derives through the site became an important tool for the design process. The derive, a situationist practice, is a technique of rapid passage through varied ambiences. In a derive, a person during a certain period drops their relation, their work and leisure activities, and lets themselves be drawn by the attractions of the terrain. The derive became an important tool since it opened up the access to dark spaces. That is, spaces that lie outside the dominant order of circulation and led to many chance encounters with situations. So here on site, the shiny glass-clad buildings rise above manicured gardens that lie gated. The people who work here, majorly in call centers, are disconnected from the city and are kind of working in this another time zone. They kind of work in these isolated shells, unaware of the time outside. The site also consists of a multi-scalar street food market, which kind of starts at midnight, and scales that vary from bicycle chai sita shops to food carts to food tempos to restaurants. It's kind of this mobile market that permeates the entire landscape. The line between public and private is also blurred. Footpaths are now used by workers to eat their dinner at 1 a.m. in the night, by youngsters to chill, and by lovers to meet in secret and nurse their wounded hearts. The site also has dark spaces which give rise to nocturnal poetics. The trope of sleepless night evokes the time the poet overspends with the moon and the stars as she pines for the beloved. The dark space also, in some sense, becomes a critique of the 24-hour day cities. And finally, the site has a blurred line between land and water. It has a soft edge that accepts the temporal nature of the creek, thereby offering degrees of wetness instead of a strong line between land and water. So the nocturnal ethnography, which I call it a tool, gave certain inferences and certain programmatic directions for the process. So a multi-scalar street food market and then large sheds at strategic points that consolidate and become playgrounds for the same. Public spaces for intimacy, which lie between the threshold of public and private while considering safety and security. Programs that respond to the night, such as a reverie tower and an astronomical observatory. Midnight cafes, which function in another time zone, much like the call center landscape existing on site. And programs for the mangrove forest study to the soft edge of the creek. So at the master plan level, the design aims to address this very liminal qualities of the site and all the in-between conclusions. So a reverse reclamation connects and makes fuzzy boundaries between the land, the creek, and the nala, and the wetlands. The city's stormwater drainage now patches itself to the wetland ecology. Infrastructures such as mangrove nurseries, research centers, and crab shrimp shelters are proposed in each wetland, which aid to the 20-year mangrove forest proposal. A multi-scalar mobile system is proposed that continues to celebrate the mobility and the flexibility of the existing night market. Large sheds are proposed that consolidate and become playgrounds for the multi-scalar street food system. It kind of works on this idea of temporality by becoming this weekend night market. And finally, night trails and night programs are proposed at the edge, which in some sense embrace the nocturnal poetics. So for the purpose of my thesis, I'll be detailing out this part of the master. So this is the ground floor plan of the design. You can see the bunds which kind of create the three layers of the wetland. It has one collection pond at the edge of the road, which accept the stormwater from the city, and two overflow wetlands that accept the temporal nature of the creek. So the middle wetland consists of the programs, the mangrove nursery, research space, and the crab shelter in the middle, and the astronomical observatory and the reverie tower at the corners. A night trail is proposed at the collection wetland, which have pavilions that offer an experience of the night and the mangroves at various depths. And a large shed is proposed on the empty ground that connects itself kind of the main road. It has the possibility to host Friday night flea markets. Now I'll be talking through the details of each of the programs. So this is the mangrove nursery. A common roof typology is drafted according to the area required. A skylight cuts through the building, which provides indirect sunlight to the interiors. And the form is further crafted to support the specificities of mangrove farming. The mangrove nursery is designed in such a way that it supports the various stages of the mangrove growth. So in this section, you can see how the shaded planters become the skin of the building. And you can also see a certain porosity which blurs the line between inside and outside. This is the Mangrove Research Center. Again, a common roof typology is crafted according to the area required. The roof typology is further crafted for the requirement of a mezzanine floor. And infrastructures to support the crab pond attaches itself to the corner. And then punctures are made opening up the building to the sky. Programmatically, it has a library, archive, and research room. It also has two smaller tanks that house the younger crabs. So in this section, you can see how the build form is designed kind of sectionally to allow the water to flow through it. The Mangrove Research Center, due to its form, also has a dock for the boats. This is the astronomical observatory. Again, a common roof typology is crafted according to the area. An asymmetrical sky observatory attaches itself to the building at the corner. Huge circular punctures are made which kind of open up the building to the night sky. And the roof is further resolved according to the vertical circulation, which kind of wraps around the circular coating. And then in this section, you can see how the building kind of opens up to the sky, its courtyard. Also, how the ground topography modulates itself to make the courtyard accessible. On the left-hand side, you have the cafeteria. And on the right, you have the research space at the bottom and the astrophotography lab on the top. So in this section on the left, you can see how the cafe table is also kind of designed to have planters. And on the right, you can see how the sky observatory attaches itself to the built form. Tensile cables wrap around the volume and have the potential to have creepers growing on them. This is the Reverie Tower, which merges itself with the Midnight Cafe. Reverie, which means a state of being pleasantly lost in one's thought or daydream. The common roof typology is crafted. The tower merges itself with the existing roof. And a tensile cable skin wraps around the tower, which has the possibility of creepers growing on them. So what's interesting about this tower that it's located at the junction of lightness, which is from the city lights, and darkness from the surrounding no man's land. And thus, I mean, also due to its form, its porous skin, and the double-heighted spaces, it works kind of with the context to provide this daydream-like experience. These are the night trail. So these are the walkways that come from each program. A walkway is proposed which connects these two bridges. And pavilions at various depths are proposed which provide spaces of intimacy. Through this section, you can see how the underground trail the fund provides an experience of enjoying the night. Sometimes you go underground with the mangroves kind of towering above you with the moonlight coming from a puncture on the top. And sometimes you experience the tower lights passing through the mangrove leaves at kind of the eye level. So the purpose of this mangrove trail was also to provide spaces where young lovers could be intimate. This is the weekend market, which is a large shed that becomes a playground for kind of the multi-scalar street food system. And it connects itself to the main road and then kind of has these playful cabinets attached at the edges, which open up whenever the market happens. And some smaller mobile infrastructures were also designed for the night market. They vary in scale and kind of open up in multiple ways. And then through this section, you can see the scale of the shed, and the footpath was also kind of designed with bottleneck spaces for the mobile infrastructures to be set up. So on the left, you can see the exploded detail. The columns and beams are ISQQ 200. The secondary beams are ISMB 125. The flooring is made of bamboo panels, and the purlins and rafters are SQ250 box sections. And the roofing is Nipa palm thatch, which is this biomass roofing with a lifespan of 30 years. On the right, you can see the details of the planters, tensile cable, bund, and the skylight. So I would like to end with a question. What more spatial forms can be thought of through this act of embracing this very in between dark space, in between land and water, inside, outside, day and night, dark and light, and so on? And how can we start thinking of cities now, like maybe through this ontology? Thank you.
Thank you, Pranay. Are there any clarification questions? Okay, then we'll move on to the next presenter, Soundarya.
Hello, I'm Soundarya, and I'll be presenting my thesis entitled Evoking the Sense of Memory in Space. I'd like to start with an experience, a small story, a moment of realization that I had of one possible way of understanding memory. Something about the first time I met Sangat. It felt like I'd already known and been there before. Very nostalgic. Sangat was sitting in a way that felt like it was very much there, but at times not there too. It took me back home, made me wonder, what do we carry with us from a place? How does it evoke the sense of another experience? It may be the sense of the place, home, I carry within me. And when my inner terrain resonates with the exterior construct, it moves me from what's there to a similar there I've been to, and to a there of both that gets constructed at the same time. Memory? From this idea of inside and outside, which draws parallel to the concept of Akampuram in Tamil Sangam literature, I'm interested in understanding how the physical reality of a landscape, and when me as a self engages and experiences that space, evokes either my subjective timeline of memories or also the collective. Exploring types of memory associated with landscapes, as Akampuram also talks about different landscapes specifically called the Tinays. Starting with Arikamedu, a Greco-Roman port city located in Ariyankupam near Pondicherry. This is a place of heritage value. It was, today it has the remains and ruins of the mission house, just a single wall, but it still exists there. So, and then when one walks down in the extents of the site, one also sees how there are patches of land with beads and remains of artifacts still there. And as you go down, also seeing the same water that probably the ships from Rome and Greece stopped. And so this place generally has a very physical and material memory. Then moving on to another landscape called Kovekulam next to Tirunelveli. This landscape is not only talking about the physicality, but also of how people and animals have moved across it. I'm interested in how the Konar pastoralists live here, move here, rest here while they are moving from one settlement to the other. and how there's a sense of carrying home with them. There's a sense of movement and journey. And so it has a very transient and ephemeral memory. And then coming to Auroville, which is very recent. If we just look at Auroville as a place, it's only 50 years old. But then even before that, it has a pattern of having a very multi-layered sense to memory. Then, so I'm tracing paths as a method to discover inner and outer memory. Where if I am walking in one of those sites and moving across the context, or as Tim Ingol yesterday said, attending to the land and certain happenings on site, and then seeing certain value to it as a self, or even collectively understanding it because of a particular history or a narrative that it holds. And then connecting these moments or incidents in the walk to create a path, to create an experience of memory. So seeing Auroville as a place to walk towards, walk from, walk with, and walk for. And my initial intuitive and bodily responses to this multi-layered sense of memory was a collage where I was trying to respond similar to the memory, also responding to underground, to the ground, and because Auroville has a sense of canopy above ground as well. Then exploration through models where I am thinking of the path as a way to go about memory, but also to engage with the site and respond to it. Then, so I'm taking the idea of a path and experimenting it in each site. And the first two sites, for example, Arikemedu, where it has, the path is a walking through, and in Kovekulam, it's a standing, a pausing of time. And the site of Arikemedu has existing ruins here and open grounds where the remains and beads still exist. And the responses to the remembered landscape, to the ruins and the remains were first explored through a collage. And this shows how the path from land to water and connecting the in-between becomes the place of stringing spaces along and creating a space of memory. In Kovekulam, I'm choosing a site where there are the fields of grazing and the particular kulam, which is the water body for that particular village. And the response to this place, I feel, was because of its vastness and because of how endless the horizon seems and things like that. It is a place of coming together, coming under shade, coming together of people, animals, practices, and knowledge. And so, certain responses. Now, coming to Auroville, where I'm actually going to delve deeper and work with memory. This is just a series of pictures. Even though it's just 50 years back, this still is considered very ancient. So seeing how the land evolved over time. From being completely barren to today being completely forested. In Auroville, I'm tracing a path to locate the site that I'm going to work with. One of those paths being the Visitor Center walk to the Matrimandir viewing point, and in between crossing those happenings of sorts, including Popo Pingal's 10 circle. So now we have three different landscapes. We have a path that I'm taking, and then also seeing the path evolve into an institution, into a place. So each site will have different institutions of sort. derived and inspired from Richard Mackay's diagram, where he said a place connects all of these aspects, and his archaeological big project used this diagram to actually begin. And I'm looking through the same diagram through the lens of memory. And so the dictating factor in each institution is different, because Arikamedu, for example, because it has the ruins, is then more associated with conserving the ruins and conserving artifacts and exhibiting them. Whereas in Kovekulam, it's about interaction, about sharing space, about documenting their stories and practices, etc. And Auroville is a larger institution, maybe, where because of the megalithic burial site, because of the park, there is a sense of heritage to it, but there's also it's work in progress, where because that's there, then you get to work with it and develop it into something else that can be shared, that can be worked with, that can be studied. Discovering the site while tracing paths in Auroville. So this is the site where the existing 10 Circle Park exists. And there are varying paths that intersect. So this is like a point of intersection, which also shows some paths some walks that I had taken on site. This is how the park looks. Unearthed circles, that's Popo there, and some of his artifacts exhibited as well. So seeing the process as first attending to the existence of objects and happenings on Popo's site. This is while excavating. And then where there are trails of path as means to bodily respond to the land and traces of memory. Some fragmented parts of the path as a whole. And extending the grid. So while excavating, there was a particular grid, and I'm using this grid as the underlying physical trace of memory to work with. And I'm taking this grid and extending across the entire site. So that's the drawing of the excavation, and this is the sculpted land. And with the site, my path, and the grid, then there are some spaces that start emerging in between, which then, moving back and forth in time through the experience, a certain evocation of memories may occur. This is the amalgamation of all, me as a self walking through the site, responding to the container of memory, the site, extending the grid, and the spaces in between happening. I'd like to end, or rather begin, also because there's a question this morning of when do we actually stop a process, or when do we know how to stop in a process? And I think it's relevant because a year back I finished my thesis, and today, like a year back, if I were to know that, I thought that my thesis was done, but that was exactly when it actually began. And it continued, and through either extensions or redrawing, or even sometimes just conversation, it just keeps going on. So I think the end or beginning only happens when we look at it as a linear thing, but I think processes are cyclical. So I'm going to begin with something that I've been dwelling on since some time recently. My meeting with memory. If memory were a person, I keep meeting this person every time as if it were the first. I take a path to meet this person, wondering if the experience of meeting changes with every path. And while on the path, I get a sense of this person at times. Is that the place of meeting? Where does this path become a place? Or where all? Is path the place of memory? I may have been meeting a place all along. On the way somewhere in my paths, I meet memory on the edge of person and place. Thank you.
Thank you, Soundarya. Does the panel have any clarification questions? Then we'll move on to the next presenter, Ronak.
of thinking and imagining. Digital which has entered our ways of living. Research becomes a dialogue between our ways of thinking and imagining space and the digital which has entered our. Yeah. Hello, my name is Ronak Soni and I'm a student of School of Environment and Architecture, Mumbai. So the presentation that I'll be doing is in the format of a video. It also has the voiceover, and then I'll be concluding the work. Yeah, thank you. The research becomes a dialogue between our ways of thinking and imagining space and the digital which has entered our ways of living. A code can be simply understood as a system of signals or symbols used for communication. How does this logic of code translate to architecture? Robert Evans, in his essay, writes architects do not make buildings, they make drawings of a building. Taking this further, it makes architecture a notional practice, and drawing becomes a type of visual code that contains information about the built form, which is interpreted to translate it to a physical form. The thesis focuses on questions of how mechanisms of the digital realm shape the nature, sense, practice, and physicality of space through spline virtual simulation, subsurface division, big data, and AI, which is clubbed with machine learning. I would like to set up the term digital here. I argue that the idea of the digital is a method of thinking through numbers, almost as an additional sense, rather than it related to computers, technology, or the internet. It becomes the initial catalyst of curiosity and inquiries of the everyday and the self. To understand the analog approach of architecture, I start with Domino House, designed by Le Corbusier. It was a diagrammatic design for the domestic sphere and the city at large. He developed the structural skeleton composed of horizontal slabs and pilotis, giving the rest to an ad hoc. This reduction of architectural form to structure is crucial here, which can be observed as a response to the economic process over a design decision. It also sets an example for using the new materials offered by the Industrial Revolution, that is, reinforced concrete. This need to translate exact information for construction, calculation, and approval reduces thinking of space to shape, size, and two-dimensional drawings which are precisely annotated. Orthographic drafting further evolves to standardization. in terms of production and concept both, where a bedroom can be distinguished from a corridor solely because of its proportions. I extend the means of measuring space to Villa Savoy. This method of thinking about space in orthography with drafting tools can be opened in four separate ways. It makes the space into elements which sit together. Each element demands space while defining them in orthography. It almost adds separate space. The architect gets the final control and authority in decision making. And lastly, it makes space measurable in two dimensions. It took some time until architects and academics began to explore the possibilities of new digital tools to create different approaches to design. As I trace here, we can see the shift from orthography, where the method of drawing is to making lines, to introduction of splines. Splines established previously unimaginable blocks and made drawing parameters and equation-based procedural process. This model, based on calculus and topological description, allowed for variation and continuous flow of forces. Subsurface division pushed this thinking beyond the equations of spline to messy point clouds, breaking the streamlined nature of previous form. Every digital shift, spline, simulation, subsurface division, big data management, and AI has implications on physicality and spatiality, changing the mechanics of structure, privacy, permanence, standard, sensorium, and construction. The design further inquires with the question of how one inhabits the digital. The first step was to investigate ways the digital logics can reconfigure space. What could be the new type of narrative generated by numbers? Can it be experienced without the layer of drawing or lines, giving a sense of its very nature? Following three are explorations which talk about the possibilities of digital logics. Formally, it provides an opportunity to speculate higher dimensions, which are drawn through various forms of projections which are non-linear and beyond the orthography. It also puts forward the idea of an ephemeral space which exists in the shimmer and intensity when observed from a distance. Here, the experience generated becomes a result of the grammar and syntax defined by the code. Architecture as a spatial design adapts to these new spatial understandings. Then, such hybrid architecture can claim the criteria derived from varieties of non-locality, such as mobility, flexibility, dynamics, viability as a new coordinates of space. Overlaying these coordinates onto the physical, the city is imagined as a conceptual section from the edge of the sea to the mountains. The mapping of the city reaches its limits in the physical with its clearly marked edges. Digital provides an entry in the interstitials beyond these boundaries, permeating the landscape and blurring those edges. To demonstrate design strategies, five sites, namely flux, invisible, in between, leftover, and post inhabitation, are located in the section. Each one is held through a physical force, as the name indicates. These forces were mapped through the digital logics which governs the design process. Moving towards the question of the nature of space, I'm thinking of a kind of space for me and others who are interested in this inquiry and engaging with the digital, placing the very question of form in the contemporary for the post-digital, imagining the physicality of that ecosystem. The logic of space remains constant. The form in which it manifests itself offers various possibilities as an installation, an autonomous being, a space to meet and explore, a space to question, and finally an architecture to hold. Coming to the first site, a water edge. An edge which is constantly in motion presents a possibility of dynamic mapping and reading. The drawing process here feeds on data of tidal waves, which is broken down to a series of sine curves. The other images map the intensity of waves. Both of these are combined as become the drawing of the site. The anchor points follow this data, developing a movement pattern which can be laid out on site. Each point extends as an asymptote, forming a curve that is a resultant of the tidal data. Vectors developed from these forces combined are made to run through an air particle system, which gives a turbulent form. We are always aware of the tide when present on the edge of the water. Even if we do understand the logic of why it occurs, the phenomenon still remains incomprehensible at its scale. Here, the intervention gives a volumetric experience to this, forming an entry to the sea. The intervention emerges during low tide and submerges in high tide, which allows for dual interaction with people and the sand, forming a space of patterns, movement, and play. The structure is built from high-tension polymer sheets supported at 7-meter intervals. The profile tapers in between to allow for the stand, with smaller arms made from interconnected 3D printed polymer, which can move via a central string system. The string travels between the hollow body, controlled by a motor mechanism. The digital here emerges in the performance. The second side here works with movement. Public square and junctions become the space constantly filled with bodies of moving people. The intervention here proposes the movement of force through these bodies. Transliterating a 3D projection of a tesseract, the object is devised which would be left on the junction in number. Each tesseract glows on its own rhythm. Over time, nearby tesseracts cause a spontaneous order phenomenon and they start to shine with the same rhythm. When a person pushes or shakes one of them, it reverts to its original unique rhythm, influencing the light of the nearby units. This sets a series of disturbances to the rhythm as a butterfly effect. If the people moving are not even aware of their autonomous behavior affecting the larger self-organized ordered system, although it becomes visually perceivable. Digital materializes here in the successive patterns caused due to interaction, almost like a new age flash. The invisible occupies the volume left between two structures. This phenomenon of a residual of volume is also seen in synonym when the bodies interact with the digital tools. There is a shrinkage in the space occupied in a very specific manner. Taking ahead the conclusions from COVID glossary, the interstitium was imagined as a space for autodidacts. A cultural space then becomes post-educational. The resultant form is derived as a map of daily activities involved when engaging with gadgets and media. A point cloud governs the larger volume of space, making an interactive, iterative design for each. The form emerges as a result of tension and correlation between the two volumes. Three types of pods are developed based on a set of activities of work, leisure, and rest. These blobs are studied as a series of tension and compression forces acting on the surface to derive a frame for it. From an analysis of a series of site photographs through machine learning software, it gives a map of light intensity in the site. Depending on where it will nudge the least, a group of these units are placed on site. This can be accessed through a net ramp which ties to the larger structure. The surface of the unit is made with Nomax canvas and with spun emerald, which makes it durable and fire resistant. The canvas is a three-layered system where the exterior is held with the frame, an insulation layer, and lastly the interior, which gives the desired finish. The wooden frame of varying diameter set up the primary structure. The frame members have protruding parts which are responsible for pulling and pushing action with the fabric which gives it the final form. Due to the tensile nature of the generated network, it becomes a space for collective and individual at the same time. Ruinous landscapes as a larger narrative represent something of the post-physical. A narrative is held in vantages and remains of the site, forming our ideas of memory. The intervention here tries to provoke once inhabited caves of Kanheri. Trying to decode memory through movement in space, the interstitial is seen as an intermediate condition between figure and ground, between form and space. It is the result of a process of spacing which involves the transformation and recording of vectors and flows, each having a density or a force. Given the idea of memory that permeates both the cave and the space, I have to begin with a diagram of neurological/genealogical activities, transforming it to become a trace in the organization of space. A brainwave frequency diagram is overlaid onto the site. It sits between the topological model of the site and caves as an anchor point. The intervention operates between the digital map of the brain as frequency and the geological terrain of Kanheri, trying to blur both into an heterogeneous space. A slippage in the grid structure occurs, causing intermediate spaces to develop. These spaces condense, narrow, and deepen to provide a multi-layer experience from any point. The morphed drawing is overlaid with the movement drawing, which becomes the entry point to the objects in space. This new axis moves diagonally across, cutting the grid of Kanheri. Thus, the diagrammatic structure from which the architecture is produced tries not to embody memory as a form, but rather develops a form that is a trace of its process. The resultant morphing structure is mostly made from transparent and translucent materials, which allow for reflection and reflection to shape the images of Kanheri as one walks through it. A timber frame with connecting tension rods holds the piece together, resting on a minimal steel footing which can be placed with the least amount of touch to the rocks. The intervention is conceptualized as a temporary installation which can keep meandering through the terrain. Designing with algorithms and with running the process builds the foundation for a new kind of space. These forms are based on behavior of an intelligent flow of swarming points, each of them executing a relatively simple rule, acting according to the local awareness of their immediate environment. In the four cases, we see the diagram has the capacity to continuously adapt and generate form to space. This new kind of space is not only designed through computation, it becomes responsive. These explorations were an examination of the role of the digital and computing in developing techniques for temporal and spatial continuity and change at the level of a virtual device. Here, the term virtual indicates not merely the immaterial, but also the diagrammatic tools by which Concepts are actualized to create technologies which occupy the zone between the abstract and the concrete. The intent was not to design a form, but to search for and set up a transformational diagram free from traditional authorial constraints. Taking the drawing process ahead from lines in orthography, equations of spine to simulation, surfaces in sub-D and data, attempt was to see drawing as a code and mathematical function. Digital logics, when entered as a method of thinking through numbers, provide the possibility of making a difference in experience of being in space and time, and not through gadgets, tricks, or gimmicks, but through a deep understanding of the relation of the subject to the object, reaching awareness in process. The research becomes a dialogue between our ways. Yeah. So, I mean, in just to summarize, I was trying to cull out different types where the base mathematical model of thinking had shifted. The inquiry has always been in the realm of drawing, and us as architects producing the drawing of the space. Although I use computational heavily, it's the intent is in the drawing. Like the computer should not, it's not the core of the design process or the method. The the intent was in the drawing, and I think the panel which I have is also there in AR, so you can scan the panel and certain videos will play and you can see in greater detail if you are interested. And I've also tried to make all the codes and 3D models available to all on my GitHub page, so you can download it and explore if you want. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ronak. Are there any clarification questions? Thank you for your presentations. I will begin with a summary borrowing instances from the projects. In the sub-theme, we discussed the choice of thinking and drawing tools, probing the basis, emphasis, and implications of these choices. Here we begin asking how tools are informing the approach of the project. How do these tools lead to further understanding of the project? The Slowness Project adopts tools of writing and drawing, performed through the hand, mind, and body, where the movement of the hand on paper allows her the time to think and observe her actions. Visualization through plans emphasizes movement arising from principles of pause, interval, cooking, and communication established in the theme. The Nocturnal Project deploys the tool of the eye of the camera, used to map and draw observations. Observations from the method of nocturnal ethnography forms the basis of the programmatic interventions. The Digital Project sets constraints to visualize using digital tools such as geometrics, algorithms, code, and animation, prompting us to ask what parameters are set by the designer to employ these tools. We know certain tools enable us to emphasize certain aspects of design. The projects emphasize the time and speed of engagement with the tool, where the speed with which a tool and its medium allow for the expression of that idea is integral. Then how do we choose tools following the trajectory of emphasis in our design process? Here we situate Here we situate thinking and visualization tools in their methods, probing the nature of these methods, asking what informs the sequence of engagement with scales. When does one begin visualizing in 3 dimensions? How does the designer choose her sequence of moves? Is it an intuitive response to every action, or does it follow a rationale? And what forms its basis? The slowness, the slowness project is reflective, where learnings from the first intervention inform the next one, using previously adopted hand tools arising from initially established principles, where the designer pauses to analyze the first moves and then takes up the next intervention. The memory project emphasizes spatial qualities endured in macro design strategies. Here, the designer deploys multiple tools where spatial qualities are visualized through sectional collages, organized through plans and 3D models, emphasizing bodily engagement, where the method involves visualizing spatial qualities endured in macro strategies. The trim tabs project is iterative, where there is a back and forth in the method adopted. The 2 iterations comprise different intentions, where the first iteration in turn helps better understand the narrative. Here, both iterations engage with different mediums of visualization. In one case, sections, and the other, the unit and layout scale. These largely use the same tools of hand sketches and digital mediums. Following the trajectory of emphasis in our design process, do we see a proclivity towards one type? What are our underlying biases and default positions? And how do they seep in the actions of the designer and the tutor? Is the method open to allowing various lines of thoughts and dropping them when required? We encourage attendees to reflect on these questions and note them down, which will be taken in the later half of the discussion. We will now take a 5-minute break while the team arranges the seating for the moderated discussion. Thank you.
अभी अभी दो मिनट
Arun. We are just waiting for a couple of minutes for all the panelists to arrive. Okay, I guess we'll begin the session. Uh, so as we were discussing in the morning, the first session was about concept, and this session is about methods and tools. Of course, there would be a lot of overlaps between the two. Um, but I think what we are primarily discussing is what happens after the concept phase of the project and before the third session where we are actually talking of design. I know there is a problem of chopping it up like that, but just because we have three sessions, we have some themes for that. Um, so I would like to open up by asking, maybe having certain broad topics that we can discuss, which I think Pati Aishwarya was also pointing out. Um, and my first question was regarding the selection or the choice of the method itself. How do you go about designing once you know the program, the context, so you have the project? And in that, the first question was, how predetermined is the method? Like, do we know even before we get the project that this is how we are going to go about design? So we do hear a lot of practices having a specific design method that they use for all projects that they get. And famously, for example, if I look at a Frank Gehry, who, who famously starts with a crumpled piece of paper as a model, doesn't matter what the project is, doesn't matter what the program is. So there is a premeditation of the method, which the practice has maybe evolved over a period of time or come from some uh, uh, position they are taking vis-a-vis architecture. Yeah? So maybe a very quick round for the student presenters as to whether they knew that this is how they are going to go about doing the project before the semester began. And for the panelists, for the practitioners, I suppose the question would transfer to in their own practice, how premeditated or how pre-decided is the method that they would follow for design. And for some of us who are also into academics, so when we offer a studio or when we offer a design studio, do we already decide that this is how we want the students to design? Yeah, so maybe first round, I would like all the students as well as the panelists to sort of respond to this question.
For me, personally, the method came after the concept and after I decided the project, because as I was dealing with the darkness, and my method majorly came from my literature reading of the situationist, and what does it derive to? I mean, how it sort of constructs this psychogeographical reading of the city, and it sort of kind of opens up the access to dark spaces. So, I mean, the darkness as a concept came first, and the derive as kind of this tool to explore darkness and kind of it, and in a way also it sort of developed various meanings of darkness through the ethnography. So yeah, so the method came post the concept.
Um, I think it took a lot of time even to come to a point where I knew where it might go, because I think I was looking at an intangible aspect and trying to, also because I was supposed to get it down as a design project. So Somehow it had to become a program. Somehow it had to become something. But I didn't know at any point of time that it would be what it was, what I should. Even it was more of spending time on site, allowing for clues to emerge while drawing, while making. So there's a very long phase of just making things and not knowing what it will become, writing it down, sketching models, and so that. And only after a point, I think the collage was the point when then drawings and institution, the idea path, everything emerged. So, and even then, I didn't predetermine or neither uh, my guide, we didn't know exactly what it would become till now also.
So I had no idea of what the program would be. Probably I figured out somewhere midway between research and design. And but so the narrative could have gone anyway. It could have been a slow library or a slow museum or a landscape project entirely. But I my guide saw something about in that illustration. That was the starting point when I realized that the kitchen has something. And I think it's also from reading Now Saito's, as I mentioned, which has been a inspiration for entering through the.
Yeah. So I think in terms of my dissertation, I was quite clear as where it was ending. But the moment that happened, I had no clue where to go or how do I take this ahead. And we had a lot of discussions almost for 2 months whether should the design be in VR. But then you are critiquing that if you are saying digital is about numbers and not computing, then why go back to computing? Or then should it be in the physical? If it is in the physical, where, why, and how? And uh, still the method was not very clear. And I remember we had this sort of a class discussion after 1 month where students were presenting their conceptual ideas and strategies. I just went with like 4 slides with some questions, like almost no clue where to go. And the starting point of for me in thinking began where my guide and I were discussing how Newton calculated pi. And that became the thought process which I took ahead and then started thinking about almost drawing as codes. And one of the questions that Aishwarya asked earlier, the intent, I did not set much parameters. It was, the attempt was to almost transliterate that space as code. And one constraint that I had on myself during the entire design process was to not sketch or look at any ideas, so that I have already sure to not have a preconceived idea or image of a form, so that it remains true to the process as much as it could or can.
In my particular case, because the studio itself had two iterations, at least for the first iteration, there wasn't much pressure to have like the ideal process or method to arrive at it. So we were more experimental. Like I almost spent 3 weeks trying something and it didn't work out, and I had 1 week to finish the project, so I had to do it. And at least, but in the meanwhile, because like we knew that we had another attempt at it, so we were also constantly thinking of ways that I can formulate the method for my next iteration. So kind of clubbing experimentative process with the limitation on time was helpful, because if not for time as a constraint, you can keep experimenting forever. So that was helpful in my particular case.
Well, that was a very interesting range, but I think by and large everyone is saying that at least in their projects the method emerged as they went about. So switching to our panelists now, maybe Rizvi, if you could start by talking of uh, as your practice develops, do you see that there is a proclivity or that you know what kind of method you'll be using for any project? And is that something that develops as the practice grows, or is it some sort of position that you have for yourself before the project comes?
I think
everyone can already understand from the 5 projects we have observed that every project is individual and every project is different, has their own method and identity from philosophical view, from understanding, from how they want to develop it. But I think the tools we have, the technology, the sketchbook, the pen we have, uh, that helps us responding to different situations. Um, if I have 5 tools in my hand, uh, I'll feel equipped. If I have 15, I'll feel more equipped. And probably when certain situation comes up, I'll use any of the tools that I have as when it is necessary, uh, as per necessity. So for me, we have been working in so many projects like almost 30 to 35, and uh, individual projects we have to respond differently because time, there is budget, there is this client need, there is this communal issue, and everything was different for all sort of projects. So I think I was writing it down that the different methods, it comes from different people, from different projects. But what we observed from this 5 project is from the first and the 5th project, uh, technology and skill was very much practiced. That gives power. That gives you power. That when you are out there, you can use these tools because you know you have already used it and you know you can use it in a right method. And the other projects, these were more philosophical and way of seeing things, individual way of seeing things. So what does philosophy do? Philosophy gives you direction to new way of living. That this should be the way of living, and that 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 grows into the project, and that makes the project go into the right direction. While technology and skill lets you be equipped and ready to act whenever there is a situation. So yes, from my experience, I would suggest everyone to be equipped as much as possible, to explore as much as possible while you can, and when you are out there to really react, so that you have it in your pocket and you can come up with the right tool and react in the right time.
No, maybe I'll ask it in a simpler manner. Do you ever think that in your practice you crumple a piece of paper, put it on the ground, and say that this is the form? So, in your mind, are certain methods of designing already a no for you? Uh, that was my question for the method.
So 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 yeah, I have had gone through these struggles, the concept and these ambitious ideas or new ways of seeing, because you can do so many things. There is no limitation. You can look for so many new ideas, so many methods, and what will build you or what is your identity. So I personally chose the rational path. Like whatever I decide, I need a logic or rational thinking behind it. Even if it's a scrambled paper, there should be some rational thought. Like it's a psychological perspective, or I need to create an identity, new identity, but that has to be well thought. Otherwise, I get lost.
Okay. So you're saying for you, as long as there is a rationale behind it, it makes sense. Samuel, would
I can't believe I'm put in this position, but in defense of Frank Gehry, because I've had several friends who work for him, the first thing that they do is they build a very, very rational block model and sort out the program. So they take rational architectural steps and then they crumple paper. But I would share your sort of spirit in that we also tend to take a very rational approach. I think the first thing that we always try and do is learn as much as we can to understand, again, all of the things we've been talking about under context, site, situation, those kinds of parameters. From there, our response to that is I'd say highly varied, even including the people on our team who are working on it. Some of in the same way that your choice is to use certain digital tools predetermine a certain outcome, our decision to engage with carpenters predetermines a specific outcome, or to work with a visual artist from Europe, or to work with a climate engineer, or those things lead to outcomes. And so I think the role of architect as curator of not just collaborators, but also processes is a really important thing to keep in mind as we kind of go through these steps.
Do you want me to respond? I'm not,
So building on that, so this method of going about designing in practice, is this something that evolved over time with the practice, that you felt that this is probably the way of going about the act of designing? And how much of are there, or maybe are there some projects where you design in a completely different way because the program is different, or because the time available for the project is different? Or would you say that we can identify a case design project through the method that it employs?
In a way, I would hope not, but at the same time, especially as I get older, have tendencies. There's no question about that. I had an amazing, I was talking with some students last night, an amazing teacher when I was at SciArc. I think he spoke here last year, Perry Culper, who talked about all different kinds of methodologies. And it was great to hear about the Dweeb and Situationists, because that was some group of people he spoke about a lot. But all different kinds of practices for creativity, formed a program, and it's been 20 years, so I'm not going to remember many of them. But I think what I try to do in response to your question is to, whenever we're starting something, to really challenge what my own predilections are, and to put forward to the team of people that I'm working with. Sometimes I offer, this is how I would think about it, but I truly welcome a sort of different point of view or a different approach to that process. And so, the individuals who are working on that within our studio, and like I said, within the sort of realm of collaborators we work with, I'm very eager to sort of have those, for lack of a better term, slaps upside the head to sort of be dislodged from my natural tendencies, if I can put it that way.
Maybe looking at it from an academic perspective, we do see that, of course, these are final year projects where I think students choose their own program, and therefore, to some extent, choose the way they will go about designing. But largely in education, you see that design studios or years are recognized by the program that they are addressing, or the complexity of the program that they are addressing. That if it is in the Indian context, for example, if it's semester 4, it's residential or housing. If it's semester 5, it's institutional. Semester 8 is urban, so on and so forth. Very rarely identified from a method perspective. This, of course, doesn't mean that there is no method followed, but in academics, how do you see the role of predetermining or not predetermining the method while talking about design education?
Tools, concepts, methods, methodologies, really great questions for architecture students and architectural researchers. In fact, with what could be identified as the practice turning research, whereby, say, at doctoral level, when you're doing a PhD, increasingly in the Australian context, in the Swedish context, in the UK, not so much in the US, but there are opportunities at PhD level to undertake practice-driven or creative practice research. So part of your research includes producing creative projects or works, or else exploring creative methodologies. And so this is something that I think has shifted aspects of the discipline in really interesting ways at that higher level, and but which is something that's kind of curiously familiar within the 5-year. In Australia, it's 3+2, but within the 5-year degree of architecture, by the end, when you do your thesis, there's research and there's design, and the two kind of work together, you know, and you choose your project and so forth. And so, of course, this naturally raises the question of how am I doing it? What is my method? And often I wonder whether in discussions around creative practice research as a broad domain, it's a bit of a quick and dirty trick, but often what I do is distinguish it, say, from scientific method. And so this is, you know, be wary because this is very reductive, simplified argument. But let's say in scientific research, and it's not always the case, but often you have a tried and true method, you apply the method and you expect to get the same outcome. And the test is in achieving the same outcome. Apply the method here, you get that outcome. Try it in the next laboratory, you get that outcome. We know the method works. In design, in the creative disciplines, art, architecture, design, I think the whole relationship to method operates in the reverse. We don't start with a method. We, as we've heard before, make a bit of a mess. We venture our way in. We might have certain processes that we've, you know, developed through experience over time that are informed by a certain intuition that's been really around, you know, the time we've spent on one design experiment after the next. But in a way, methods, we're doing something, but then the methodology is distinct from the method. So if the method is what we do, the methodology is the logic of the method, the theory of the method. We only come to that reflecting after the fact. Oh, what did I do? Well, I did this, and this is how I reflect on it. And this is how I'm seeing it working out, at least at the doctoral level of education. I think we see it also with those final thesis projects that students are doing at the end of their degrees and when they do, let's say, a master's. And so I think this is a really curious resituating of method and methodology. I'd also say that, and I'm responding to what you were talking about in terms of how you challenge your own predilections. I think if we're like a creative practitioner, then the deepest challenge to our work is the risks of habit, opinion, and cliche. You know, we get used to a method, it's kind of worked on other projects, we stay inside a comfort zone and we don't push ourselves toward experimentation. And actually, as a creative practitioner, we need to be slapped on the side of the head occasionally, we need to open it up for discussion, we need to be, it's like we're constantly exploring new methods. And it seems to me that's because each problem that we're addressing is, as you remarked, very distinct and specific. So the same method isn't always going to be applied in the best possible way. We need to allow for an adaptation of methods. And as for the tool, well, the tool is meaningless until we've got a method of use or instructions for use. You know, so there's a distinction between the tool and the method and the methodology. And these are some of the reflections I've had on this. Also coming out of the fact that in our discipline in architecture and design, I've found in the academy, it's very difficult to get, it's quite challenging to get grant funding, let's say from government bodies, because we're actually bad at describing our methodologies. And that's because we've done this, we've tended to do this in quite an intuitive way. So there's an increasing challenge for those trying to get grant funding to, despite the fact that they're often intuitive methodologies, to nevertheless describe them so that the grant body will give you the money because they trust that you've got an okay method, which is still a bias toward the sciences, of course. So these are some of the challenges I'm seeing, you know, playing themselves out. Yeah, great questions, though.
The very fact that the wide variety of projects, yeah, in a sense, are tied to the single idea of a method. And also the overarching theme of this forum, which is a process. To me, very explicitly tells, which is, I'm sure is applicable to academics as well as practice, that design cannot be approached as an aspect. So that is the larger idea. So you're not going to tell the client, nor the student is going to come and tell the tutor, look, it happened. Don't ask me. So you can't afford to do this. Okay? Why? Because at the heart of the education is to tell each other that a design can never be an accident. Even if it happens, you need to rationalize it. I'm using rational in a very flippant manner, but I'll problematize that in a moment. This is my first point. My second point that I read, I'm just trying to recall, I think it's Ignacy Morin who wrote this wonderful essay, whether an architect is a magician or a surgeon. Okay, and he says all architects would love to portray themselves as magicians because out of the hat, you pull the rabbit. So you would like to say that it is a creative outburst. But either the same architect or another architect would be working precisely like a surgeon. You find the problem, find where it is, put your knife precisely because you can't afford to do it otherwise, and go for it. So I think, and also another wonderful paper talking about not only Gary, but Kuhn and others, who likes to design closing their eyes as a surrealist way of doing. This paper tells actually at the heart of it is not that it is that no process or no method. At the heart of this rhetoric or this device is to increase the authority of the designer as a magician. So because I don't have to explain because it's all in me. So without me, we don't have the design. That's all. So I think this question of method is caught between these two things. One, the very idea that all of us want to be very clear that the design is not an accident. And two, either we use the rational or the other irrational, so to speak, is also to increase the authority of the designer as someone who is knowing and again approaching it in a clear-cut manner. So to me, even in the most what appeared as the most personalized thing like the path and the experience eventually comes around as a way of entering into placemaking or spatial arrangement or whatever. But my last point is this. I've been an opinion writer for a newspaper 8 years full time, day in and day out, keep writing. But my editor never asked me what is your method of writing. Okay, but he always wanted to know whether I've substantiated what I have written. So I think at one level, what's happening here as well as in other places is not so much rationalizing, but actually substantiating it. So there are different ways of engaging with the method, but eventually at the heart of it is that it's well thought out, it has a logic, it has a process, either in the Popperian sense of generate and test, or have a framework and then generate. I think it works in all ways. So I think without a method, we cannot possibly run a school, I suppose.
I love this. We're coming at these problems from opposite ends of the spectrum, which makes for fabulous debate. I love the happy accident. You know, I love the fact that we start and make a mess of things and we kind of dive in, and I love the intuitive aspect. But I'm also hearing you because then there comes the point of having to communicate. At some point you have to communicate, and it's going to be no good if you just say, oh, I just kind of did it and it worked out. And this is an interesting discussion also. You know, many artists who are coming back to the institution to undertake PhDs related to their art practice, they get terribly nervous of having to give away the magical trick, you know? So the magician, figure. They go, if I talk about it too much, I'm going to destroy that sort of je ne sais quoi that's kind of embedded in my process. I don't want to describe it because that's dangerous. You know, it'll disappear. And yet I think we do need to find, you know, we can make a mess in process. We can have some happy accidents. I would want to argue for them. We can be open-ended in our exploration, experimental, try the different tools. But then at a certain point when we have to speak to the stakeholder, the local municipality, our client, then of course, post-justification does come in, and it's fine to have a bit of post-justification. It's not an evil thing, whereby we have to explain after the fact what has happened. And this is also, in this debate today, I'm recognising that another part of the discussion here around tools, methods, methodologies are our modes of communication, that is our representational tools, and that these are really loaded because, you know, every drawing style is packed with a kind of ideology. And you have to be on top of that. You have to understand your mode of communication because you might accidentally be communicating something that you hadn't intended to exactly through the way your medium is carrying your argument. And so I think this too kind of enters the picture, and you know, how you're presenting yourself on the wall and so forth is part of the challenge here too. Yeah, anyway.
I'm not going to extend the debate, but I'm just can't resist recalling an anecdote. Some of you have heard it from me before, please bear with me. But I think at least few might not have this before. As an young student, I'm listening to Ram Sharma, and he talks about intuition in design. So he goes on and on and on. And then his lecture ends. My friend who's next to me, very naughty person, he just stepped up and said, Mr. Ram Sharma, I have a question for you. And he said, what is your question? If you think intuition has a role in design, okay, how would you evaluate the design? So Ram Sharma quickly says, yeah, I would say, if you come to me and you say, I just did this design, I felt like that. Then Ram Sharma said, then I may have to tell you, I don't like it. Don't ask me, because I intuitively dislike it. Okay, so I mean, I use this for different purposes, but here recalling is because also the discipline's own tension, and even practice has its own tension. It's something that is situated between the heart, which doesn't have to explain anything, even doesn't have to say anything, as against the design as a service and a service profession. I think is that kind of a dilemma, or that sort of a straddle, I won't even call it dilemma, moving between these two.
Pratigya, I just want, in continuation of this discussion, from your sort of education as an architect and then moving on to primarily doing research, this role of the role that method plays in design and now in research, for you must have been like a long journey of this question of premeditated or predetermined method versus the accident or intuitive. So how do you look at it?
When I was practicing as an architect, I think my thoughts were still forming, and I really didn't have a take on methods first or design question first. But coming to it as a researcher now, and after having sort of responded to many a research question followed by, you know, research method, methodology, using tools and all of that, I think the most appropriate response would be to quote a dear colleague of mine who works at IHS, Gautam. He said, methods never belong to, no, questions don't belong to methods. So methods always belong to questions. Meaning to say you don't start with a method and then try and put your question around it so that your method can answer your question. But you start with a question and then you do justice to the question by looking at what method can help you most appropriately answer that question. And I think it may not be very different in architectural practice, although it is a little different because there's a lot more creativity and individualism that comes in. But perhaps at the heart of it, when you're delivering a project for a client or responding to a design problem, a method must answer your problem rather than a problem having to fit into your method. I think that's where I have rested now. Yeah.
I think uh, I think when you were mentioning about this question comes first and the method, I think it's also about the ownership of the method. I think when when someone start owning that it's my method and it's my tools, then I think the question start coming that should I, if I don't follow in the next project, will it remain mine or not? So I think like when it and then I think I really like the way you put it that I think question comes and then you to rightly to answer that question you find this method, because sometimes what happens when people start in the practice is architecture practice, when they start taking an ownership of those methods that oh, like I am owning this method and this is the way I should practice, then they start doing oh, if the project will shift, but then oh, in the last experiment I did the same thing, and if I change my path I'll not have an identity. So that is also, I think, changing a lot. And I think it's an individual stake, which I think people are taking, that someone will stick with those methods and tools, and someone will stick with the questions, that each projects will bring new questions and then we'll answer it. So I think it's also, should we take the ownership or should we don't take the ownership? Like, what is that? Like, it's a dilemma.
Outsider now. I really wonder, can you own a method at all? Can you ever own a method? Can any individual or a firm own something that anybody can use? And even if they do, like patent or whatever it is, what is the point? Like, so I don't, what is the point? Because ultimately you're building something so that people can use it, or there is always a purpose to what you're building, and probably the purpose is defined in the problem. And so I mean, I just cannot wrap my head around right now from where I am to wonder how can a method or like how can a process be owned. Yeah.
So along the same line of discussion, since methods and tools can't be owned, what do you think are the best attributes for a successful or a good design? Because it seems as though you need to address various attributes of good design, and you require different tools and methods to address those attributes. Or do you think that a tool or method has stood the test of time, like, in the literal sense? Sorry, I didn't exactly get your question. So are you asking whether certain tools and methods inherently are appropriate or are tested and therefore would produce good design? Yeah, so certain tools and methods would address certain attributes so that, for example, a camera would be ideal for addressing a certain aspect of inquiry, which inherently addresses a certain aspect of design. So maybe we'll pick the tools question later, but for the method question, in fact, for all the presenters, I had a question for you. For a moment, if I imagine I take Ronak's process, the way you went about, and apply it in Nitya's project, that you started with slowness, but you use this method. Or I take Almitra's method and put it in Soundarya's project. What do you think would happen? Can you have that sort of, can we for a moment imagine what would happen if, yeah, that's exactly the question you're asking, right? If I pick up someone's method, this method, and apply it, if the whole project was done like that, the concept was retained, the intention of, say, slowness was retained, but then I used algorithms and digital thinking to arrive there.
What do you think? Do you feel unnerved by it? Do you feel that it might some ways not do justice to it? So in that sense, is there an appropriateness to a method for a given intention, design intention?
I just wanted to say one brief thing before you answer. I think we need to differentiate in method, which is more aligned to process, and technique, which are more aligned to tools. Because I would say your process was maybe perhaps the most intuitive of anyone else's, but it was so heavily dominated by the tool that you chose that was maybe masked even to a degree that you weren't clear about. But yeah.
Kashi, thank you for asking such a wonderful question. Because it asks for us to imagine things. No, it's okay. The method doesn't matter. Whether you're standing or sitting.
The tool does them.
The tool, maybe it does something to taste, but not to taste. Yeah. So I was thinking that at least 2, if not 3 of the projects use the technique or use a method really, which is closely aligned to the situationist dairy method. With Saundarya's is also a dairy walkthrough. And the Mumbai project is also a dairy, the Mumbai project also. And to some extent, I would say that other project of slowness combines some other methods, some other techniques. The intent of using the dairy is to find unexpected things. But the intent of the architectural project often reduces itself to finding expected things, especially in an academic system, which expects you to come up with a product of a certain kind. For example, I was thinking in Mumbai, what if nothing had been done? What a wonderful place that was. And whether the intimacy required those sheds or intimacy was all the time finding unknown places which could not be identified. And the very identification was against the method which you initially chose. And I think it is the naming of the subsequent process which leads to, then of course the tools can be various. The tools are so many. And some tools are more oppressive than others. Some are easy to dream with. Some are more demanding of your continuous and wakeful attention. And the digital is demanding a certain attentiveness, which is actually going back to sleep. That attentiveness is an attentiveness to the domination of numbers, and the other is an attentiveness to the flickering of your musculature. And I think this kind of discussion really calls for seeing whether the method is a question or the entire orientation of the architectural academia is a problem. I think that is where the question should, because all these students have done their work and they've done their methods and so on. But whether there is something which is in the system which demands a product, and that product has to have a certain square meterage, it has to have a certain volume, it has to have etc., etc., etc. So I think that architecture is already there. And the derive might only say, but that's what I felt in the whole, all the discussions. I felt that we are going round and round in circles by concentrating on method, whereas one should look at, does architecture have to intervene or enter everything? Or is there a role for life to overtake architecture? I think that those are questions which arise out of this conference. Sorry for disrupting the whole thing.
And that's fine. I thought that was what the third session was about, because it talks of where does all this lead to, the way but I think it's an important question to ask. But I would still like the presenters to sort of go on an imaginative sort of.
Actually sort of lost what I was thinking, but to think like this distinguish that you make between tool and method is something that has almost come to me prominently in different forums and when I was discussing with other peers and professors, where I did not like one thing that I was trying to go away from these tools. A lot of things that I was using here, I was not aware of them. I was learning them simultaneously, exploring. The drive was to sort of set up a method to now hypothetically think if I was to measure slowness. We may do it digitally with if it's to deal with measuring space through numbers. We may or may not involve a computer. Let's say if we start mapping the space to the radius to which aroma is going, and we start using people there instead of a computer. We start having talk to their daily customers and start mapping radiuses for it. Like this happened that it was the question, look, when will digital become space? And thus the method. I had never thought of it the other way or the inquiry. I mean, it has almost been a to and fro question to make it so clearer for me so that I don't dangle through, because there is a certain very dominant narrative of digital that dominates architecture right now. And I find it slightly problematic. It always tends to go towards metaverse and these things and heavily on computers. I don't feel like as designers or people from the fields of humanities, our intervention should be in the methodology and ethics of measuring rather than the tool part of it, because engineers are there to do it.
But all of your decisions were intuitive decisions. The decision to use the tides as a system of mapping, and then the tool produced how that was mapped. But at the end of the day, also as those grains were waving around, you as a designer intuitively decided when to stop, right? When does that animation, that process, that morphing, when does that end? And so that was an intuitive decision, right? So in that sense, I mean, these are conversations Greg Lynn, Hernandez, Alonso have been having since the late 90s. So these are very, we're going into 25 years now of this kind of process and talking about digital and technique and methodology. But the only point I wanted to make was that, and it's not a criticism at all, but your methodology was not digital, your technique was digital. Your methodology, in my opinion, was simply intuitive. And we can evaluate the results of that in a separate discussion.
I'm trying to quickly remember who said this, but I think it's quite relevant to this conversation. So it says, any process agnostic of its outcome, one has to be wary about it. Somebody made this. Any process agnostic about its outcome, or indifferent, maybe agnostic would be a very light word, indifferent to its outcome, is something one should be wary about, because that answers that question as to why probably the slowness wouldn't want to use another method. So the actual physical form may not be evident, but in a sense, there is a connection to the method in which the person uses. It could be even partly of ignorance, so to speak. So I only know so much, so I'm going to pick from what I know. Could heavily weigh on that. I'm not discounting that. But I'm saying even for that person, whatever one knows, there is still a choice to go about doing that. So the person makes the choice. And the person makes the choice, I assume, is because the person sees, if not the actual outcome, but in a sense believes that outcome would lead to something closer to what one person, if not completely visualizes, but wishes to. So to me, I think people will not swap the method. Yeah. And I would not use this method to do that, and I want to use that method to do this because I have some inclination about it. That will be my.
Oh yeah, totally. Fantastic. Well, first you changed your proposal midway, which significantly changes the meaning. So when we move from like a method about which we're agnostic what the outcome will be to a method whereby we're indifferent about the outcome, these are totally different things. The first for me is more interesting. We're agnostic in that we don't believe one way or the other, which is not to say we're indifferent. We don't know. We follow the method because we're looking for something unexpected. And I actually think that this is a wonderful thing. You're criticizing it because you're saying we need to know the outcome. We're using the method, it's tried and tested, which for me is much more a scientific paradigm. No, you don't think so? Okay, I missed something there.
Maybe it is something closer to the ethical question of the relationship between ends and means. That the ends and the means are interconnected, and that process has to have some idea of ends, but is more concerned in the means.
Because you put it crudely. It's lovely to hear the commentaries on the sutras, yeah. So, but I'm just saying, even though that's not how she explained, that the choice of that method, in a sense, has an indication of what it may deliver, if not in its precise configuration and form and specificities. Because I'm just wondering, put it very crudely, would a slow person use a fast method? I'm not really meaning at that level, but I'm just saying something closer to that. So I think the person and the intent of the project also chooses the method. So that weighs on it.
Continuing that, in fact, if we go into the specifics, I was quite intrigued in all the projects, like, for example, Nitya, where you were drawing, you were drawing that plan with the bricks, where you were saying that it was slow and you were thinking of where to shift the brick. And at one point, you showed some drafted plans. So I was quite intrigued that when you are designing, that when you shifted from that way of designing to drawing a, say, a 200 scale plan or 100 scale plan, Saundarya, it happened. I saw it in your project as well, that there were these layered drawings of memory. You were drawing one line, and it seemed that after some time you were drawing another line. And at some point, we saw a plan. Even in the Derive project, we saw that there was a lot of churning. And then at some point, we see those axonometrics with the roof. So I'm quite intrigued that in that way in which you're using that tool to help you visualize space, I would just like to know what kind of friction were you comfortable making that 100, 200 scale plan at any point of time? If given a chance, would you simply have not made it because you felt it was, because to me, the moment you're drawing brick by brick or thinking space by space, and then you have to draw a drafted plan where the same line goes from one room to another room, from one end of the site to another end of the site. In your mind, you have walked that distance in one line. Right? So I just want to know what was happening when you were doing these projects.
So I think when it came to the second task, I wasn't thinking about the principles and applying and removing bricks and working that way. It became about this idea of having like a maze-like movement or something which was not totally taken from research. It was something that I wanted to do and something. So the minute I said slowness, and I literally thought it was about moving physically slowly, and that remained till the end. And I wanted to use that idea somewhere in the design. So I think that's why the second task was more about that. But I think if I were to continue the thesis, I think I'll have to research more about what details and no, it'd be beyond just removing bricks. I think there'll be another level of research I'll have to go to understand what slowness is in 1:20 or 1:10.
No, nothing wrong. I'm just
Slightly getting bothered about this question. Yes, there is a deep exploration. It's a very abstract thing. You dig into your experience, you connect your experience into some logical steps, and eventually you're converting it into a building. But that's what you're expected to do as an architect, particularly in the academic setting of an undergraduate. Otherwise, I would say, please go to the neighboring college. And probably in the philosophy course, you may write a treatise. But here, you're creating a facility of sort. And you're trying to be as sensitive as you could, both from within yourself and also connecting with the world around in a far more sensitive way. And you're struggling to figure out something. And that figuring out could be a real struggle, slipping between something inexplainable, but also to be explained, communicated, and also converted. So that leap may appear as if it's a sleight of hand, which it has to be at a certain point because the process will only take you up to a point, and at some point that to make it into something else would require a certain jump. And that could be even something very tacit.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'd like to share an experience. Maybe 25 years ago, I ran a studio. Yes, that was 25 years ago, I think. Yeah. There was a student from Holland, and our site was narrowed. There was no program given. Each student had to work out their own program. And Dimfy said that I am amazed at this place. I want to just be there, hang around and see. I'll try to work out a project. A few days later, she came back and she said, I want to do a project of making no place, which has no qualities at all. And she struggled through the semester. She had, in her theory, she spoke for maybe 1.5 hours, if I remember right. There were perhaps 300 drawings. And at the end of this, she said, I'm sorry, but I have not been able to make no place. Now, this learning that happened, even though it did not end in a significant, you are right that it might be that in the philosophy school, that would be a better presentation. But I think sometimes in the architecture school also, there has to be a exploration which fails to end in a recognizable product. And the oppression of the product on the mind is certainly something which should not be bothering the student. I feel that it is, and I know it will be unfashionable to say that, but students should be, we should I often say that a teacher is a cheater. You just turn it on. You have to fool the student into believing that the product is of no importance for something productive to come out. And in that sense, I feel that there is a reasonable distinction or reasonable expectation of a method leading to a, an architectural discovery. And I think that is where this jump, the jump of discovery could be somewhere very, very different from where the normal architectural product comes.
Just a quick, I just want to add stuff. I need to get in this. Yeah, I agree, but I can't make that as the center of my architectural education. That could be one of the experiments. I mean, it could be one of the things, but it can't be the thing of the thing.
There should be no the thing.
Yes, that's the thing. So we have to do things, is the argument that I'm making. So it can't every time be to know things.
To in a way somehow wedge between the two of you. A question arose during the lunch period about how often, if we keep saying process is not a linear thing, design is not a linear thing, how often do we go back to remember our context during the design process? Especially, I'd love to ask the students who presented. That, in a way, puts in perspective what Professor Chaya was talking about and puts a little bit of a question to what Professor Shivatsan is talking about, outcomes. How often in a process do we revise outcomes based on the discoveries made during the process? So, for instance, I start at a certain point, arrive at a certain stage of decisions, maybe program, let's say, because of certain parameters and factors and analysis, it is decided I'm going to build 10,000 square feet. For instance, I revisit my original contextual studies analysis, maybe intentions, remind myself, because we do forget, we are human after all, and realize, my goodness, somehow that can't be sustainable for whatever reason specific to the project. How beholden am I to build the 10,000 because perhaps the studio said it was 10,000? That is what is being asked, I think, that how fixed are outcomes and who are they fixed for? Is it for a standardized rubric or metric? Or is it really in the spirit of education? And where are accidental discoveries in the process? In practice, it's fine. There is a certain leeway. But I think in the context of students, how much do we fix them to an outcome?
If we really believe in what we keep saying, that design is a wicked problem, and it kind of unfolds itself as we try to address, that is very much part of the process. It's up to the tutor and the student, I suppose. If it is a very rigorous, intense, and honest to its own process, would not hesitate to do that, because we strongly believe that design is a wicked problem. The problem cannot be entirely fully defined, and as you engage, you will redefine the problem. So I think there is a scope, but that's up to us to explore it, I suppose.
Yeah, just to maybe like answer a couple of, in my process, A was I did not want to make the plan, but somewhere I was, because I was doing on the derive, and then I thought that what if my outcome is a derive in itself, the intervention. So there is somewhere, and somewhere I was also limited in delivering a program as an architect. And then here, I mean, I might go extreme, but I believe that architects over here are not just to build a building, but are imaginators of space. And then this kind of space can, they kind of look at that space, the space of maybe dream, the space of the digital, the space of the physical, but as an architect, I would define someone who's not just building, but sort of asking deeper, nuanced questions of space.
I just had one comment, like in that discussion, and this is something I was thinking after graduation. Like, is there an imperative to build, for a lack of better word, to be taken seriously? Like, you know,
No, I think this is a fascinating sort of trail of discussion. But coming back to the point, I think maybe the way I asked it was misconstrued. It is not my question, since it's about methods and tools, it's not so much whether each one of you at some point felt that you didn't want to make a building, but there is also this notion that making a plan at some stage is the act of finalizing the design of a building. So my question was that when you're doing part visualization, just one part, one break, or you're making one perspective sketch, that is also design. You have designed one part of or one imagination of the building. But there seems to be this strong idea that the project, when I say that I'm building, it has to culminate in a plan section or an axonometric, some sort of an orthographical projection. So my question to all of you was that, was there some sort of disjunct or resistance you felt when you shifted from a non-plan section axo way of imagining design to making a plan section or axo? It's not so much of whether you need to design a building. That is also an important question, I think. But my question was, what happened when you took that leap?
I'll try to answer both because I'm also thinking about Shubra's question and yours at the same time. For me, I think it was the collage, both understanding context and remembering and going back. I think more than remembering the context, for me, that point in time or that stage of making the collage was when I think I had a sense and understood the context. So whenever I kept thinking that where in the process am I, or am I going on track or off track or whatever, my reminder would be that collage actually. Because at that point, more than the plan, I felt that collage was what the design was. Like every single response or every single move that was thought of was then and there actually done. And the plan was more an extension of that collage to see the layers in a different dimension. And also seeing how it is when it's seen with a particular measurement. So if I am walking on the 10 circle path and then saying that, okay, there's this tree right now, so I'm moving this way, or like the unearthed circles are on top, so then I go around it. Or there are thick bushes here that no one can walk across, so move this way, that way. That was the first response, and that's how the collage happened. But then trying to draw that in scale on plan also made me realize that, oh, there is the grid as well. Then grid got extended. So those accidents, I think, kept happening, and the collage was the stage or plan, as how you're describing it, that I kept going back to.
So for me, I think it was the illustration that was my guide, and I, at some point, he told me your entire thesis can be just that one illustration, and you just print the entire illustration as one, and that's the design, and it's done. But then I think I was scared at some point that each doesn't have a section or a plan. So I had to do the plan, and
I think in my particular case, it was slightly different because I had to start with plans and sections because of the scale and the project demanded it. And after working with plans and sections, and if I, at some point, I thought maybe I cracked it. And then when I went into the space, I would personally probably adopt something of like her technique. And then I would change the entire plan and I would never finish the project. So for me, it was the struggle was rather the other way around.
So translating from the plans and sections to the spaces was also equally difficult, I would say, as much as like translating a certain collage or an illustration into plans and sections. I just want to pick up on one thing that you said, which sort of connects back to morning's session as well. You said that, that collage is the point where you understood the context. And, just thinking about the conversations we've been having in the morning about concept and context and concept, and now a method to understand design or get to a design and all that. I feel like it's so iterative, here is somebody who's used a method to understand context, which probably in a very linear format, you should have understood like at the beginning, even before you got to your concept, even before you got to your methods and, your design. So it's like, I just want to take a moment to say it's so fascinating that it's so sort of, like the process is so non-linear in its way. Yeah, and a method can not just sort of be used to answer a problem, but also just sort of, understanding something like even as basic as a context.
I think I'm really fascinated by how she's saying that there's a collage and then from there's an attempt to make a plan. But then all the time you want to stay with the collage because there you have something that you cannot identify, cannot put your finger on. And I think it's a remarkable thing. I'm reminded of how at the, how when our interest in this thing that we call process, if you think about it in a sense, it's something that has really been brought to the fore by, in a sense, by 20th century modernism. This idea of staying with the beginning and delaying having to sort of straight away commit to some kind of an imagined end result or an outcome. Delay as much as you can. And this kind of freedom from that what we do as designers, that's something that sits in between, above, beneath, below, somewhere, rather than the means and the ends, rather than the beginning and the end, or the initial sort of intention and the final outcome. To sort of find, to not that, how does it is process only if it is not representational of that causality. It is the thing. It is, I mean, if you, I mean, no, it's quite, because it's learning and the work will have any kind of transformative or even emancipatory quality only if it resists this sort of, having to, as long as it thought, I mean, I don't want to make it between these 2 points, but I just have to bring all ourselves down, the feet on the ground. You can't escape that fact. You have to work with constraints. That's always there. I mean, anyone who's practicing will tell you that is there. You can't wish it away.
No, I think a lot of this discussion would also probably spill over into the next session. But I just wanted to come back to the idea of tools because we discussed methods a bit. And then when we are discussing tools, of course, a lot of people say that in an ideal situation, the tool actually disappears because you don't make any distinction between your body and the tool that you're using to perform whatever act that you want to perform. And that is your familiarity with the tool that you're using for a given purpose. And I think you brought up Robin Evans, who talks of translation from drawing to building, where he says that for the architect, who the architect is only designing or giving a set of instructions for a building to be constructed. And in that sense, she never has the possibility of actually seeing the space before it is too late. And therefore, there is always that gap that Ivan says, that loss in translation between what you imagine the building to be using a set of plans and sections, or whether it is digital walkthroughs or whatever it might be, and the actual building itself. And there is that slippage which occurs. And I was very interested because each one of you is using different ways of imagining the building, whether it's a collage, whether it's a set of plan sections, maybe isometric. Various sort of tools are being used to sort of imagine what the space would be like. But I think this acknowledgement of this slippage is what makes us want to have some sort of ambiguity in the imagination of what it could be. And that is where I feel that, some of you are saying that till the mode of or the kind of drawing I was making was itself ambiguous, it still allowed that. But the moment I had to maybe make a 500 scale plan or maybe an axonometric, there is a sense of fixity to it. But then you are saying that for you it was the other way around. So I'm quite intrigued by what happens when we use one tool of visualization versus another tool of visualization. And through that, we are trying to imagine what the space could be, and none of us know what the real space would look like. And
I think that raises a really interesting point in the sense that what are the tools, techniques, methods that we use that enable us ourselves as, let's say, as authors to derive what we imagine those spaces to be? And then what tools, techniques, and methods do we use to then convey that to others, right? Because if you're talking about memory, the most eloquent way you conveyed a sense of memory was through a poem. But I can't give that to my contractor. I can explain it that way to the client, and maybe that's sufficient. Maybe their experience doesn't need to be a literal walk through a path. Maybe it is just through the production and experience reading or internalizing that poem. Not to open a larger can of worms in terms of what is and isn't architecture, but I think I just wanted to make that distinction between what it is that allows us to satisfy ourselves, to internalize that vision, and then how do we then take that as either individuals or a team to then share that vision out into the world. And that's to some degree where architects, like, that's where their I don't want to say ability, but that's where their role ends to some degree.
It's a fascinating question. And I continue from what you said. But I'll bring in something else. The Indian musician is a very interesting creature. The musical instrument cannot be tuned. It is made in such a way and with such materials that it cannot be tuned only before the program, and it will go on through the program. So there cannot be a set of instructions which are complete in themselves. And therefore, the attention that the musician has to give is to three things. One is attention to her own body and how the hand is moving and so on, or both the hands are moving. The second is the attention to the music that is emerging, because there is a rag on which there will be an improvisation. And the third, there is an attention to the behavior of the instrument itself. And from time to time, she will have to retune the instrument, even in the process of the program. Now, it is only in recent times that the architect was made to legally enforce this kind of a thing, that your set of instructions have to be flawless, and that you cannot, And I was thinking, the cathedral in Florence, they built it and then they didn't know how to make the dome, which was there in the drawings. But nobody knew whether it could stand or not. And they had to have a competition to find out how to build that dome. So if architecture, even at a huge scale, could take uncertainty into account, why is it that we are building a profession? And this goes beyond today's discussion. I'm sorry, but always the questions are larger than what we are into. So the tool is something which is part of you, but which also all the time presents challenges. And those challenges deviate from the single minded attention to one thing, and a multiplicity of strands of attention have become present. And I think that is where the fascinating part about tools is. All the tools, I mean, probably we can use every single tool that every one of them has used and still be sort of attending to whether we are precise on that tool or not. And I think that's wonderful.
And I think that's also probably one of the reasons why, even as practicing architects, we love to go to site while the building is coming up. And if possible, we like to, some people, some architects, we like to change a few things, whatever, say a window or say light or a little light, because you are constant. It's the first time you look at the building in full scale on site, and then you feel that despite all the years of experience, I would still like to modify something, because that is then giving me the actual feedback. Of course, that in academics is not possible. So that cycle gets complete only after you have seen the building. You could even go to the extent of saying that I want to see one entire year pass through the building, the summer, the winter, to actually understand whether the tools that I use to visualize that space and how it actually turned out, what are the slippages or what are the accidents, sometimes maybe happy accidents that happen in that gap.
Yeah, maybe a small train of thought then. Then the drawing, maybe the axo or the plan or the section becomes, in some sense, it becomes a knowledge system, right? Of looking at space in the X, Y, and Z. I mean, what if space could be represented by sensoriums or something like the derived, like the city is not a plan anymore, but it's sort of. So I guess it's. I mean, as an education, also architecture should escape this dominant knowledge system of drawings and representations, and
Maybe escape is too strong a word.
And also, I would like to make the distinction that Samuel was making. One is the use of the tool to visualize space for yourself, because you're still designing it. And there will be some representation or communication tool that you will use to get the building constructed. That also need not be plan section, but eventually, if the project is of making a building, then there has to be some way in which you communicate it to others that that building gets done. As long as the tool allows you to do that, I suppose it should be fine. It could be a set of verbal instructions, a poem. Like one anecdotally hears that before plans and sections, before the idea of the orthographic projection, the act of getting a building constructed was a set of verbal instructions to get the building constructed. But eventually that instructions are required where there is a shared understanding of that language of communication.
So just to reflect on the tools and the method thing. So I was just having a module a few days ago, which was about the module name was architectural kitchen. So the module so we talked about how tools in the book Are We Human? So they talked about how tools form the human method. where human brains are the effect of the tools and not the generator of the tools. So I always relate the idea where how the jalebi is made and the 3D printer, which on site makes. So the jalebi, from the jalebi comes the 3D printer, and how architecture can be baked, the clay thing, how architecture can be baked throughout. So for me, I think the intuitiveness and the ambiguity which was talked in between, like how the tools help us in between small nudges are made from the tools help us generate new tools, and the tools are not just the operative to get to something which is architectural design.
I'm really taken by this reversal that you just that you just performed. It's less that we choose the tool or that we make it, but the tool chooses us. And perhaps likewise with the method, it's less the method that we choose and the method that chooses us that takes us over. And I think this is quite often the case, because often the tool has arrived before us on the scene, for instance, or maybe the method. And so to understand, we kind of hit it from the midst of things, which was another sort of contextualization we heard earlier, that we're sort of arriving at the scene perhaps a little late as the architects, is a really compelling thought for me, I think.
The archaeologist saying the tool makes the man. The Gordon Child's great conception of that the tool is not an innocent thing. So it has its own life. And as much as we contemporarily kind of paraphrase it and say that the methodological trap is equally a concern, which also comes from that sort of an inquiry. But I think we come a long way from being the primitive person. Now, we've gone past the truth, so we can always interact with things. We have accumulated experience and knowledge to be wary of things. And logical sense there, Mr. Chaya.
I think it's a very, it's only the colonials who called everybody else primitives. And I think it's perfectly
You're
fine
hearing it from a brown man, so it can't be colonial. So.
No, but think about the tools that we're using on a daily basis right now. So the iPhone would be a primary tool. Some of us drive cars, for instance. Increasingly, we don't have access to the knowledge that builds the tool. We can't tinker with the tool. All of these tools, we don't have access to them, you know, and I think this is something really important to reflect on, because, you know, historically we would have been able to tinker, mend, maintain, but meanwhile this is proprietary knowledge. And of course there are great resistance movements, kind of, you know, repair movements and so forth, critiquing this. But I think it gives us another understanding of the sorts of tools that we use, but we don't understand. So that gap in the knowledge too, you must wonder to what extent the tool is continuing to form us, especially, you know, with the reception of social media and how that's forming our opinions on the scale of a population and so forth. These are dangerous tools indeed.
Okay. I think as usual, we have run out of time for the session, but of course we have tomorrow where we'll continue some of these discussions and we can spill over.
Thank you everyone for this enriching discussion. Maybe the wand chooses the wizard. And on that note, we would like to call everybody to the double volume for high tea. Thank you.